Hey everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I want to talk to you about primary production. It's basically a conversation about photosynthesis. And the truth is, energy transfer pretty much underlines all biological interactions. And so it's rather important, and might add somewhat interesting. And so primary production is basically we're talking about the conversion of the energy of the sun, especially if we're going to consider photosynthesis. And let me jump back to that. And so let me throw in a little sun right here. And so what we're talking about is the conversion of the energy of the sun into carbohydrate. And so carbohydrate, plants are able to produce a carbohydrate, CH2O. And how are they able to do that? They're able to take in carbon dioxide from the air and water from the soil, and then as a consequence, they also produce oxygen as well. And so this is called primary productivity because what we're talking about is these sugars, these stored organic energy sinks, are going to be what is powering the trophic level. In other words, these sheep gently grazing right here in this grass are benefiting from primary productivity. So the plants, the autotrophs, the photosynthesizers are producing that sugar, and that's what's powering all the trophic levels up. And so this is happening both on the land and in the water. And so in this aquatic environment, let me go back here. In this aquatic environment, it's interesting because here you can see algae, and the light is traveling down into the water, especially in the photic zone, and the algae is picking it up and it's converting it into carbohydrates and in oxygen. And so let me actually take a side look here and sort of diagram what's happening. I think it's important to consider this, and I'm gonna so picture that creek that we were just looking at, okay? And so I'm gonna attempt to draw that river. So here we are underwater. This is up above, and I'll throw in the sun up here that's shining into the water, okay? And so this is again not very deep. This is the photic zone, and then in the water, here are the algae or the aquatic plants. I'll just make a big leaf like that. And so what's happening is this plant or algae, what have you, photosynthetic organism, is producing carbohydrates and oxygen. And how they're able to do that is that there's dissolved carbon dioxide in the water, and the carbon dioxide is coming into the leaf. And in the leaf, there's little tiny organelles called chloroplasts. And this isn't a discussion per se of this, but it's basically where photosynthesis is taking place. Chlorophyll is the pigment, and so it's taken in water, carbon dioxide, right there. These are the inputs to photosynthesis, and through the chemical reaction of photosynthesis, the plant is making a carbohydrate, and there it is, carbohydrate, and it's also producing oxygen. And so there you have it, photosynthesis, primary production. And so the interesting thing is, let me pose this question, like, why are we even interested in it? Well, we're interested, again, as I said, because it's very important. If, for example, if you're a consumer in the water, you need to make sure that there's enough plants to eat, and there's enough oxygen in the water in order to survive. And likewise, this is important on the land as well. And so one of the obstacles in studying primary productivity is that it's very difficult to measure just how much carbohydrate and oxygen plants are making. Because as it turns out, they're actually consuming some of the sugars and oxygen themselves. Now, this may be an obvious statement, but I'm going to point it out. Because inside of plants are capable of respiring. In other words, cell respiration. And they do this in another organelle called the mitochondria. So let me write that out. So cell respiration. So the reason that they're actually producing carbohydrate and oxygen is so that they can burn it. And so the sugar and the oxygen is burned in cell respiration, and the outputs of cell respiration is carbon dioxide and water. Fancy that. It's basically the cycle, the energy cycle. Okay, so what we're talking about, the total production, the green right here of sugar and oxygen, what we call that is the gross primary production, or GPP, gross primary production. But it's very difficult to measure that because they're, as you can see, they're consuming that. And so there's still some sugar left over and there's still some oxygen left over. So let me go with that. So check this out. The leftover oxygen diffuses out and is in the water. And so this is leftover minus respiration. And so if you were to calculate this, let's just go like, let's go white up here. So we could say that plants' gross primary productivity, in other words, the total amount of carbohydrate and oxygen is produced, is really the result of, if you were to look at that gross primary productivity, and you're like, well, what is this? Well, in fact, respiration is using some of it. Do you follow that? It's using some of it. And so what is available is something called net primary production. In other words, this is what you could directly measure. If you're standing over here and you're sampling the water, you can measure net primary productivity. It's hard to know how much respiration is going to take place, and so we can solve this problem actually. But I just wanted to point out that it's a little bit of a dilemma that we're only able to directly measure net primary productivity. But if we can determine how much they're consuming during cell respiration, then we can determine gross primary productivity as well. So I just wanted to point that out. So let's go back over here if we can to the slideshow. So all that's happening in the river, there's obviously the fish can eat the algae and getting some sugar, and also the dissolved oxygen, they're breathing it. And so we have these two ideas, gross and net primary production. If I can use an analogy, it's sort of like if you've ever had a job, like say for example in the summer, and your salary is, let's say, $1,500 a week. And so you're like, well, that's your gross salary, but in fact, taxes are going to be taking some money out of that before you can actually get the $1,500. Say the taxes are $500. So what you're actually taking home, the take-home salary, is $1,000. So this is what I'm talking about. The net primary production is the $1,000, and the only thing you can measure is the $1,000. You're like, hey, look, I have a check for $1,000, and you're like, well, interesting. Since taxes took out $500, I guess I originally made $1,500. So that would be the gross. And so this is our sort of our logic here. So the primary production is the total amount of organic energy that is produced in photosynthesis and oxygen. It's all the total amount of light energy that's converted to chemical energy. But the net is basically equal to the gross minus the respiration. So in other words, if this is your 1,500 minus your 500 for taxes, then you're actually taking home 1,000. So we're only able to measure net primary productivity, but we could determine what the respiration rate is rather cleverly. So let's take a look at this. And so check this out. So say that this is a river in question, and we're kind of curious about primary productivity in the river. Okay, so this happens to be the Merced River in Yosemite Valley. And so since oxygen is the more easier thing to measure, we have the ability to use sort of some chemical means. Like we're able to actually stick these little ampules into the water and sample it, and then through some interesting chemical reactions, it will actually turn what is invisible, dissolved oxygen, into a color. And for example, in this picture here, you can see the darker the blue, the more oxygen is in the water. And there's different chemical tests that you can employ into this river. You could use chemicals. You can even use probes. You can stick a probe, electronic probe in there, and actually read it off of a sensor. It's pretty cool, but let's safely say that you could measure dissolved oxygen in the water. And so when you're doing that, it's a little bit easy to be able to measure it, but you can't measure gross primary productivity because, again, they're consuming some of that oxygen themselves during respiration. So what you're actually needing to do, so let's take a look at this. So net primary productivity is actually what's available in the river. We can measure that. So the idea is like, well, what's the gross? So in order to know what the gross is, you have to know how much they're respiring, how much of it they're actually using up. And the only way that you can determine that is, check this out, it's rather clever. You could take some of the plant material, in other words, sample the water. Let me try to draw this. So you could scoop up the water and put it in you can put it in a container like this. You can put it in a water bottle like that. Okay, so here it is. And inside of it, there's obviously some plant material like this. And you could measure the amount of oxygen in the water. But check this out. If you took the same bottle and you put some aluminum foil around it, or put it in some sort of opaque material around it, in other words, you're blocking off the sunlight. So if you block the sun, so there's no light penetrating into the bottle, what you could do over a set period of time, let's just say it's 1 day, what you could do is you could initially determine the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water. Okay? So let's just make up some numbers. Let's say that initially the amount of oxygen in the water was 10 parts per million. There's the units, parts per million initially. And then after 1 day, since they're not producing any more oxygen because you've darkened the bottle, they're only respiring. So in 1 day, you sample the water again, and guess what? There's less, predictably. There's 8 parts per million. And so, interesting. So the plants are respiring. So how much did they respire in 1 day? That would be 2 parts per million. So if the respiration is 2 parts per million, and you originally measured 10, that probably means that, the gross primary productivity is in fact 12. So it was making 12, using 2, therefore 10 is available, and that's the net. 10 is available. Available for what? Available for fish. Well, I say fish, but really any consumer. And so photosynthesis and respiration play an important role in primary productivity. Okay, but there's some other, those are biotic factors. There's some other factors as well that contribute to the amount of oxygen in the water, and this has to be considered. There's some abiotic factors in addition to photosynthesis and respiration. So this may be just totally obvious. Again, a person on the street, if you ask them, hey, what's influencing oxygen in the water? And they're like, the first thing they might say is, well, look at this. The water is turbulent. It's rushing over these rocks in this sort of riffle zone right here of the river. And so waterfalls and wave action introduce oxygen into the water. And so that's a physical phenomenon that it's windy and the rapids introduce high levels of oxygen. They may not mention photosynthesis and respiration, but this is a physical factor. So in other words, turbulence and wind. And let me throw in a couple other ones. You may not be aware of the fact that temperature, and this could be experimentally observed in the lab. And so you could literally look at the effect of temperature on how well the water holds on to dissolved oxygen. When I say dissolved oxygen, I don't mean H2O. I mean molecular oxygen. I'm talking about like this. I'm talking about O2 in the water. Think of it as like dissolving sugar into the water. You're dissolving oxygen in the water. How about this? Colder water holds more oxygen than warmer water. So cold water, if you could look at this. So if it's colder in the water, there's going to be more oxygen. And so obviously I mentioned this in detail, photosynthetic activity. If there's lots of light shining into an area, you can expect more oxygen to be produced because that's what's producing it is the energy from the sun. Now, decomposition, this is a curious one. So as organic material like sugars decay, if there's too much decomposition, in other words, there's a lot of bacteria in the water decomposing, in other words, breaking down the algae, as it turns out, the bacteria, let me see if I can draw that in there. The bacteria, if there's a lot of bacteria in the water, and this can be a problem, they're not only breaking down the sugar, but they're respiring. Bacteria are not photosynthesizing, so they're actually consuming the oxygen and the sugar in the plants, and so they're reducing the oxygen. So if there's a lot of algae decomposition in the creek or in the lake, the dissolved oxygen should be going down, so that because they consume it. So that's a concern. If there's a lot of algae bloom, then ultimately the dissolved oxygen will go down, and you're like, again, you need to come in with the attitude that this is important to care about, meaning that you're like, dissolved oxygen in the river, whatever. But no, the fish are going to die, and so that's fairly critical. And so salinity, how about this? This is, again, just a physical factor. It's a fact that salinity affects the amount of dissolved oxygen that the water can hold. So fresh water holds more oxygen than does salt water. So as the water becomes more and more salty, more and more warm, more and more bacteria, the amount of dissolved oxygen will go down proportionally. And so these are abiotic factors. And so again, you can go out here to the river and you can say, whoa, look at this. It's kind of windy and the water's rushing over these rocks. It looks like it's pretty oxygenated. And so, how do you know this? Well, again, you can stand over here along the rock and you can sample the water and try to determine the net primary productivity and see how much oxygen is available. And so that's of consideration. And so when you look at, beyond just a river, and you're looking at the earth in terms of primary productivity, where's the most primary productivity? In other words, think about it right now. Where is the most oxygen being produced on the earth? And if you answered the ocean, you would be correct. Where's the most sugar that's being produced on the earth? Where is it? It's in the ocean. And so ecologists are, it's difficult to grasp this number, but ecologists believe that something like 150 billion metric tons of organic material are stored every year on the earth. And most of that photosynthetic primary productivity occurs, as you can see here, percent of the earth's net primary production is occurring in the open ocean because it's so vast. Look at this, the percentage of the earth's surface. Look at this, 65%. And so it's so far it would shoot off and that's why there's a little break right there. So the ocean is where the most primary productivity is taking place. But the truth is, if you look at just the small area of it, it doesn't really produce so much. But because it's such a huge area, it produces quite a lot. And then of second importance is the tropical rainforest. So there's a lot of primary productivity in the rainforest as well. And so that's a real productive area. And so that's predictably, if there's a lot of carbohydrate and oxygen coming out of the tropical rainforest, that must be able to sustain a lot of higher trophic levels. And so you get a lot of species diversity. That's a real important area. And so what's fascinating about that is not only species diversity, is that it doesn't occupy so much of a large area of the earth, so which makes it very valuable since it's rare. And so just to sort of point out, go back to the water for a second, just wanted to point out that all this primary productivity is happening up here in the photic zone. So because it's being powered by light. So oxygen is being produced up here and sugar. So most of the energy transfer is up here in the photic zone. And so one of the things that can limit primary productivity is nutrient, because let me go back to this picture. Plants, this is kind of a weird thing to say, but plants for the most part prefer being on the land because the soil has a lot more nitrogen, a lot more phosphorus, there's a lot more carbon dioxide, you get a lot more sunlight. Although it's dangerous because you can dry out on the land. But if you're in the water, sure, you get lots of light from the sun, and there's a lot of carbon dioxide dissolved in the water. But some of the things that are limiting primary productivity are other nutrients, like, for example, nitrogen and phosphorus are elements that can limit primary productivity in the ocean. And even something that you may not think about is iron. I think you know that we need iron. You might know that you need to be able to eat iron. You're like, why do I need to eat iron? One of the reasons is that it's important for our red blood cells to have that in order to carry oxygen in the body. And we also need iron for more subtle things like the electron transport system and cell respiration. But we need iron. So plants and algae, phytoplankton, they also need iron. And so how about this? So if nitrogen is limited in the water, there's not going to be a lot of algae. And if phosphorus is limited and iron is limited. And so you can conduct experiments and actually add these elements into the water to see if there's an increase in primary productivity and net productivity. And so sometimes you don't want these limiting reagents or limiting elements in the water. For example, as I was talking to you about it a second ago, decomposition of algae can be detrimental, because if there's a lot of algae that's booming, then when they all die, it's going to actually decrease the amount of oxygen. And so some of our favorite lakes, like, for example, Lake Tahoe in California, you might have seen bumper stickers around saying, "Keep Lake Tahoe blue." And in order to keep it blue, you have to limit, you can't have sewage getting into the lake, you can't have fertilizer from outlining farms and you can't have nitrogen and phosphorus and all of this like soaps running into the water, because what that's going to do is increase the algae, and then it's going to die, and then it's going to decomposers are going to consume the oxygen in the water, and ultimately dissolved oxygen is going to be less, and therefore it could hurt the whole lake in general, and it'll be dominated. Now, has this occurred? Have we seen evidence? Yes, it has. It's called eutrophication. Again, it's when high concentrations of things like nitrogen, phosphorus, how do they get into the water? Well, we like to farm next to lakes because that's a great source of water. And so fertilizers can leach, in other words, run off excess into the water source, and it can cause an excessive algae bloom. And again, I pointed this out in another video. Maybe you saw it, maybe you didn't. But this process called eutrophication is happening in one of California's most prestigious lakes. And it's rather ironic, and it's rather brutally sad, if I might add that, is that the lake is called Clear Lake. And it's not clear. I mean, you gotta think back in the day, it was probably pretty clear, but now it's not. You can see it right here. It's green in coloration. There's a tremendous amount of algae. And it's clearly the effect of human interaction. It's like the farming that is along the lake has allowed these limiting reagents to come in, and then the algae blooms, and then it's an unnatural increase in phosphorus in the lake, which then causes the dissolved oxygen ultimately to be reduced. So you can see the algae growing right here. And so after a period, the algae dies, falls to the bottom, it's decomposed, and ultimately it lowers the oxygen in the water. So oxygen in the water is rather critical, because then the fish start to die, and then it sort of goes down this spiraling vortex of trouble. And so ultimately, we could study this. We can hope to control the amount of pollution, which then ultimately controls these things called algae blooms and eutrophication. And studies have been conducted even on large scale. It's hard to study this on a large scale, but you can sort of block off two big bodies of water, these big lakes, and you can see what the effects are of adding nitrogen and phosphorus. And over here, nitrogen and phosphorus were not added. And so it's a fascinating process, but primary productivity, again, underlies most of the important biological interactions in ecosystems. So I hope you enjoyed that brief look at primary productivity. Thanks for watching.